Hey, y'all, it's Brandon Adams. I'm DawgNation Daily. This is the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented today by Georgia United Credit Union. Obviously, it's just kind of one of them days, and it may be one of them weeks, where Georgia obviously comes on the heels of a bad loss to LSU, a game in which Georgia did not play well, in addition to losing with a lot at stake. The Sam Pittman news is now out there, and it just kind of seems like a lot of bad news is compounding for Georgia all at once here. We're going to have to deal with all of this on today's show, both in terms of what the current facts are on the ground right now, and obviously how Georgia gets better from this, because eventually everything is today. I'll talk about why the Sam Pittman departure provides an opportunity for Georgia, and I think many of you know where we'll go with this. We'll talk about what some of the recruits are saying, and that, if you're looking for the silver lining, the good news stuff today, that may be it. We'll focus on that. We'll do our part to start getting ready for the Sugar Bowl. I thought Kirby Smart said something very interesting about the upcoming trip to New Orleans that I think could have some potential reverberations for the rest of the program. So, listen, it sort of is what it is. This is not a good day. There's a lot of bad news, but that doesn't mean that's a static state. It won't be that way forever, so we'll try to start walking our way through it right now. Good to have you with us. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Georgia United Credit Union.
Check out gucu.org/GoDogs for more details.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
I've gotten a couple of interesting tweets over the last hour out there that this may happen or that may happen or whatever. Given all of that might go on, you got to help us out. You got to tell us how things get better. You got to remind us of some good stuff. I need some good news because of what seems to be a whole bunch of bad news kind of piling in here at one time. And I do respect that, and I do think in some form or fashion, that's kind of my role here, both because of the fact that I kind of have an optimistic viewpoint on life, and because Georgia is a really good program. There's always some good news to find somewhere. However, I also want to be very, very clear about something. I don't want to be the kind of sort of grifter who just sort of tells you whatever you want to hear and patch in the head and says, don't worry about Sam Pittman. Georgia got an even better offensive line coach coming in. And don't worry about losing to LSU. Next year's the year Georgia wins all 15 games and blah, 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 blah. I want to be able to provide good news when it's there, but I want that good news to kind of come from a place of reality, right? I just think I have too much respect for your intelligence, no matter who you are, listening, viewing, whatever you're doing. I've got too much respect for your intelligence to kind of gloss over the real truth, to sort of give you and spoon feed you exactly what you might want to hear in any given moment. So the overall point of this is there will be some good news that we'll get to eventually on today's show, and there will be happy days for Georgia again. We're just all kind of smart enough, been around the block long enough to know that that's true. Eventually the sun's going to come back out again. But I think in order to have that arrive at kind of a real place and have kind of an authentic, honest conversation, I think you have to deal with the facts as they are, both the game that Georgia just lost and maybe more prominently right now, because it just happened yesterday, the departure of Sam Pittman as Georgia offensive line coach, now becoming Arkansas head coach. This was one of those things that was kind of a rumor that was out there. For the most part, scoffed about that because, typically speaking, offensive line coaches don't leave to go be SEC head coaches when they haven't had that level of experience before. But lo and behold, Arkansas may be getting outflanked for Lane Kiffin and feeling the pressure because their geographic border rival, Missouri, was getting ready to make a coaching hire. And with the early signing day fast approaching, maybe Arkansas felt it needed to make a move that could sell to at least to somebody, fans, boosters, donors, former players, whatever else. Sam Pittman at least had the track record of having some support for the guys that played with him along that Arkansas offensive line, and lo and behold, Hunter Yurachek, the Arkansas athletic director, making it official on Twitter with Sam Pittman holding the Hogs helmet, the kind of the yes sir thing we've come used to being expected to hear when Pittman celebrates a Georgia commit. Now using that to celebrate on his way to Fayetteville to be the next head coach of the Arkansas Razorbacks, what is, I don't think this is too strong of a statement, a true dream job for him. Pittman was a very, very good offensive line coach for Georgia. He was probably the most recognizable assistant that Georgia had. A big part of the Georgia brand overall was kind of what Pittman brought to the table. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. I'm not going to say that Georgia won't skip a beat with Sam Pittman no longer part of this program. Pittman was a major part of the public profile of UGA. Him leaving on the heels of losing to LSU is a little bit of a blow that needs to be absorbed. And in terms of Georgia now trying to pivot to the conclusion of the 2020 recruiting class, some of the hay that you already thought was kind of in the barn, all of a sudden now you got to kind of call some of that into question. I'll give you a couple of examples here on Twitter. Tate Ratledge, very, very good offensive lineman from up in extreme North Georgia, a guy that's been a UGA commit, but now one of the guys that he thought he was committing to, going to want to play for, Sam Pittman not being here. What Ratledge puts out on Twitter is, I will not be answering any questions on my current situation, he says. This will stay between me and my family for now, and Ratledge offers up a thank you. And listen, I kind of understand where Tate's coming from on this. I mean, while my primary concern is how good Georgia's going to be on the field, it doesn't mean that I can't have some empathy for the players involved on this. You want to talk about just a punch to the gut, to have your entire college future seemingly planned out, the guy you're going to play for, the scenario you're going to be in, all of a sudden find out that's not quite exactly what you thought it once was. I mean, there's a degree to which I actually feel sorry for some of the players going through this, Ratledge included. You also saw some stuff from Chad Lindbergh on Twitter the last 24 hours. One of those kind of outside the typical footprint wins for Georgia. Lindbergh being a Texan, seeing the video of Sam Pittman there with Arkansas. Lindbergh says you can't blame him for making the right decision. Obviously, Lindbergh's got affection for Pittman. I think the facts of what Lindbergh says there is also really true. I think that if you get a chance to go be an SEC head coach, this is not Pittman leaving Georgia because he thinks the ship is sinking. This is a chance to go to a state that you love and coach an SEC program inside of that state. I'm sorry, you cannot turn your back on that if you're Sam Pittman. Virtually 999 out of 1,000, maybe even more than that, of people, if they were faced that same situation, are obviously going to choose the upward mobility here in that spot. But with all of that said, with the scenario with Pittman being what it is, that his departure is going to hurt Georgia, he's a difficult offensive line coach to replace, and it's going to make the conclusion of the 2020 recruiting class kind of all the more challenging now. Those are just the facts. That's just the basic truth. But have you ever heard this phrase, that in life you shouldn't waste a crisis? I'm not really quite sure who was the one that kind of started that, and it seems counterintuitive, right? Crises seem like a bad thing, and you can make a case that Georgia finding itself in the Sam Pittman situation that it is right now, that's kind of a coaching crisis. Right here before the recruiting deadline, trying to replace an offensive line coach, trying to spin this in a positive way to the public at large, to the recruiting community, to everybody else. This kind of seems like, at least within the confines of college football, a crisis situation. But I once again go back to that phrase. I've heard it used before. When there is a crisis that pops up, it's important not to waste it. Now, what does that mean? To me, in the Georgia sense of the word, what it means is, hey, the challenge of losing a guy that was such a big part of Georgia's identity and such a big part of Georgia's success now frees Kirby Smart to do the one thing that maybe he should have done all along, or be looking to do all along this offseason, which is reinvent himself, reinvent the Georgia program, reinvent the Georgia offense in particular. And I'll give you another kind of tired phrase. Have you ever heard it be said that sometimes good can be the enemy of great? With Sam Pittman, those big offensive linemen, and building the offense that way, that got Georgia into a really good situation. But what we found out on Saturday night, once again, not quite good enough to get over the hump against maybe the nation's best teams. And my gosh, LSU may be that. They may truly be the nation's best team. But maybe not quite good enough for Georgia, though, in terms of its own profile to get over that spot. And as long as you leaned on that, the great offensive line of Sam Pittman and the way that opened up holes to the running games and gave Georgia the chance to be the more physical team in a game, that was going to make you good. But now with the good gone, the good offensive line coach, some of that good offensive line philosophy taken out of Athens, Georgia, it's a chance for UGA and Kirby Smart in particular to say, how do we want to replace this? What do we want to replace it with? And for me, I think it's important to say it's more than just an offensive line coach that can kind of come in, look like Pittman, feel like Pittman, make people feel like this is still Georgia. No, I think this is an opportunity to make Georgia what it probably needs to have been a little bit all along, which is a little bit more like the dynamic offense on the other sideline on Saturday. I'm talking about LSU. Now, with that in mind, Kirby Smart was asked in the post-game press conference, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase the question, but after losing to LSU in a year in which your offense had sputtered all season long, is this now an indictment of the offensive philosophy that you're running? And here's the answer that Kirby Smart gave.
You have an offense that's built around the players you have. So you take the players you have and you use their strengths. Well, with the players we have certain strengths. We usually have good pass protection. We have a good, offensive line. We got good backs, but our ability to run the ball has not been consistent this year. And people can say, well, Coach Smart wants to play man ball. Coach Smart wants to win. And we threw the ball 42 times. Now, you can say it was because we were behind, but we threw the ball early in the game. And we had some drops. We had some misses. And it's not a matter of what is your offensive philosophy. It is what is the best way to win the game.
So a couple things there from Kirby Smart that he alludes to that I think are maybe not quite fair. He says, hey, we've got a certain kind of player, and therefore we're designing our offense based on the kinds of players that we have. But fundamentally, we know that's not true. Fundamentally, those of us who follow recruiting closely know that Smart has recruited the kinds of players that Georgia has because he wants to run the offense this way. I think it's unfair to sort of shrug your shoulders here at the end of all this and say, hey, what do you want? We're running the offense we have because of the players that we have. But the players were brought in for a specific reason. Smart also says, hey, in this game against LSU, we tried to throw it 42 times. We weren't trying to run the ball over and over and over again in this game. But what a lot of Georgia fans are going to say is, yeah, but when you were forced to play the kind of game LSU wants to play, you showed on Saturday night an inability to be able to do that because that's not what you've been doing all year long. You can't just flip a switch and start doing that. Our buddy John Stinchcomb, who'll join us in a minute, he said that himself a million times. You are what you put on film. And over the course of 13 games, what Georgia put on film is an offense that's good, but not quite great. And in the absence of Sam Pittman, the forced scenario where now Georgia has to at least replace a coach, I think the opportunity also exists to potentially replace a philosophy. Now, I'm not telling you that I think that Georgia ought to be wildly different from what it is, because what Georgia does, even in a year in which the overall results fall short of the beginning of the season goals, Georgia is still more good than not. Georgia is still closer to the promised land than it is not. I don't think it needs drastic wholesale changes, but it does need some changes. And those changes need to come, I believe, philosophically. I think that Kirby Smart's got to relinquish some of his long-held beliefs about what he seemingly wants football to be. Now, he said there that, hey, I'm not about, being committed to a certain style. I just want to win. But if that's the way we're going to judge things, then in terms of how Georgia defines winning, Georgia didn't do that this year. So now it's going to find itself having to replace Sam Pittman. And in replacing Pittman, also replacing part of its identity. This is an opportunity to make Georgia better by making it slightly different. And your guess is as good as mine if Kirby Smart will do that. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're live on video, 10 a.m., DawgNation, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. We're on the radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and we're available as a podcast wherever you find them, Apple, Google, the world-famous DawgNation.com. Just really glad to have you with us, and really appreciate Georgia United Credit Union for making the show possible. And this time of year, lots of debit cards and credit cards coming out as you're shopping and going to dinner, things like that. And you can show off your UGA fandom with Georgia United Credit Union when you get one of their Georgia Bulldogs debit cards. There's 3 different design options to choose from when you open a free Georgia United checking account that includes options to earn interest. Now listen, Georgia United Credit Union is so much more to the bank. They've got 19 branch locations throughout the metro Atlanta area. They'll provide you with access to up to 100,000 surcharge-free ATMs, enhanced security features, convenient access to your money, just through online banking. Unbelievable opportunity. So go to this website. It's gucu.org/GoDogs. That's gucu.org/GoDogs. You'll find out what makes Georgia United Credit Union more than a bank, and you'll find out about how you can get your very own Georgia Bulldogs debit card. All right, as I said before, we'll talk to John Stinchcomb here in just a moment. But for now, let me kind of push back. Maybe push pause is the way I want to say that. You deal with the ugly nature of the way that the Georgia game went down on Saturday, losing to LSU, and we'll do some more of that later on. You deal with the harsh reality of Sam Pittman being a very difficult coach for Georgia to replace. We'll do more of that later too, but we'll push pause on that here for a moment. And I think it's important to remind folks that even in the midst of a time in which everything just kind of looks kind of sour right now, and probably more bad news compounding at once than maybe at any point in time up to this point in the Kirby Smart era, there is still in this a reason to believe that good days are still to come, that better days for Georgia are still ahead. And like so many things when it comes to this program, you kind of turn to recruiting for that. I don't know if this was a concerted effort or just kind of a interesting coincidence, but a few of the key luminaries as a part of the 2020 class for Georgia, or people close to those recruits, they were out in full force after the game on Saturday. And in the midst of Georgia fans feeling pretty dejected about a season that kind of hinted it was heading towards this dull thud of a conclusion for quite some time, the words from the family of Kendall Milton, the family of Mikhail Sherman, and Marcus Rosemy himself, a very impressive wide receiver. I think they're pretty important to heed those words here today. Let me start with Chris Milton, the father of the terrific running back commit to Georgia, Kendall Milton. Here's what Chris Milton says about the loss to LSU. This is Kendall Milton's dad. My 2 cents. Today's loss doesn't scare us. He means his family. If anything, it makes the opportunity even more attractive at Georgia. Who wouldn't want to go into a situation where your presence can bring immediate value that helps you gauge your own success? Go Dogs. Congrats to Coach O. He's a good person. Yeah, I respect Orgeron. I respect LSU. But the words of Chris Milton, Kendall Milton's father there, I think they're meaningful, that we're in love with Georgia and we're coming to Georgia in 2020 to make an immediate impact. I think that for Georgia fans, you can take some comfort in those words. The same way with the sister of Mikhail Sherman, who was also busy on Twitter in the immediate aftermath of the game. Nice little Felicia Rashad gif, kind of throwing back the Cosby Show. And she tweets out, "'Twas the day after the SEC championship game, and how do we feel? Sherman and family are still 100% committed. Hashtag unbothered," she says. So one of the leaders of the defensive side for the 2020 class saying, we still feel really good about this. One of the leaders of the offensive side, at least the families of those guys, saying, we still feel really good about this. Maybe more prominent than anything, the words of Marcus Rosemy on Twitter, the wide receiver recruit, because of how the wide receivers for Georgia this year were kind of always kind of part of the discussion of what wasn't quite right with the Georgia offense. Marcus Rosemy says, I'm still all dog as well. Recruits, by and large, are just not quite as impacted by the typical ebbs and flows of a season as much as maybe the average fan is. Now, a departure of a guy like Pittman, that's definitely a storm that Georgia has to weather. But a loss to LSU, not so much. These guys believe, because they're all elite athletes and they're all incredibly confident, that they're going to come to Georgia and have the chance to make next year's SEC championship game feel better than this one does. Now, there's no guarantee that's indeed going to happen, but that's the level of confidence you want in recruits, confident in their own abilities, but also confident that the Georgia program they once loved is still that same program, even after a pretty bad night down in downtown Atlanta. So good stuff there. Hey, before I get John Stinchcomb, let me also tell you about my friends at Brasstown Valley Resort and Spa. You know, we're kind of going through the month of December here with Brasstown celebrating its 25th anniversary, and select dates this month, you get a chance to get up to 25% off your room rate when you go to BrasstownValley.com and use the promo code BVR25. That's BVR25. You use that code, up to 25% off you can get here during the month of December. This is a wonderful time to be at the resort, decorated for Christmas, fires in the fireplace. North Georgia mountains are just beautiful here in this kind of early winter time. So check out the website, BrasstownValley.com. Use the promo code BVR25 at checkoff. And in honor of Brasstown's 25th anniversary, you can save up to 25% off. All right, I've got more from Kirby Smart coming up the program. He said something I think very interesting about the Sugar Bowl. We will talk about that. But I know you want to hear from a former lineman on the departure of Pittman and kind of where Georgia goes from here. A guy who's always very, very wise with his words is our buddy John Stinchcomb. He joins us now here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Georgia United Credit Union.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
All right, good stuff here coming up from John Stinchcomb. Great to have him with us as part of DawgNation Daily, presented by Georgia United Credit Union. And John will obviously talk about the game and kind of how that goes down and really maybe where Georgia goes from here. But it would seem to be a mistake if I didn't at least start with the position that you know really well. I know the impression that Sam Pittman made on you while he was at Georgia. He was just kind of the jovial guy that everybody seemed to like, and the folks at Fayetteville, Arkansas certainly didn't forget about that. That's why they wanted to bring him back there as head coach. So what's your first reaction to finding out that Pittman won't be at Georgia anymore, that Georgia is not only looking to replace its offensive line coach, but potentially replace a bunch of offensive linemen who may now be more inclined to want to go to the NFL draft, and a lot of recruits who need to be kind of reminded that Georgia's still a place they want to be with Pittman no longer there? How do you process all of this right now?
Well, I think it's a big loss for the University of Georgia. He's great with players. He's one of the best in the field of developing offensive linemen, and I think that's what has been a draw for so many. And the reason why they want to come play for Georgia is they recognize this guy can make me better, and he does it in a way that players love him. I've been able to work with and train offensive linemen leaving college, including some Georgia guys, but also Dan Skipper over in Arkansas. Yeah. And I've never come across a guy who played for Coach Pittman that didn't love him, that raved about his ability to connect with each player that he worked with, make them better and convey the fact that he loved them. And that's going to be a costly loss for Georgia. I don't think it's going to be immediately felt, honestly. I think what you're going to see is the effects maybe 3 or 4 years down the road with the recruitment of other athletes. Hopefully, of the 5 offensive linemen that are currently committed, there's some retention there, and at least a good number of those that have already committed will honor that commitment and continue to want to come to Georgia. But I think we would be foolish to think that a big factor as to why some of these out-of-state players are considering coming to the University of Georgia is to play for a great coach in Coach Pittman.
Yeah, I said this before you joined us, John, that to me there's a degree of bad luck involved in this. You just don't typically see position coaches like this leave their school and go be head coaches in the SEC. You know, as long as it was other schools competing for Pittman to make him their own offensive line coach or, you know, some sort of title like that, you know, Georgia could always give him more money, could always give him a little bit of an enhanced title, and it seemed likely that Georgia could hold on to him a little bit longer. I mean, let's face it, coaching attrition's a fact of life for contending teams. Georgia's not going to be excluded from that conversation either, but losing Pittman in this way was something that I wouldn't have really foreseen. In fact, when those rumors first kind of popped up, I kind of rolled my eyes and said, you know, I don't know that Arkansas is going to be looking to an offensive line coach to be its next head coach, even if that's what some of his former linemen kind of want that to be. But I guess it speaks to the job that Pittman did here as offensive line coach, speaks to his, you know, personality as a figure around the SEC, and maybe to a degree speaks to the desperation of the Arkansas coaching search that, you know, they were, you know, felt forced to turn to Pittman here. It's just, and I you know, I wish him well to the extent that it doesn't conflict with Georgia's interests, but it is just a degree of bad luck, I think, that Georgia finds itself in this discussion right now, because this is not typically the way that coaching searches work out.
No, and I just, you know, I still marvel at the decision. I mean, if you're going to Arkansas, I recognize that it's a place that's near and dear to his heart, and that's got to factor in, because really you're battling for relevance to even be fourth on the SEC West right now. LSU, Alabama, Auburn, Texas A&M, that's a tough slate of teams to try to crack and stay at the top of. I don't know what the measure of success is going to be for him out in Arkansas, other than not being the bottom dweller at the list of a good group of nationally relevant teams.
Yeah.
So it was, you know, it hurts us, but other than the fact that he's got direct ties to Arkansas, I don't know how wise of a move. There's a lot better opportunities that maybe weren't available to him. But if you're going to be a head coach, I'd want to go somewhere that I felt like I could be successful.
No, I think that's a pretty fair point. Let me also bring you in on this discussion that we had a little earlier, which is, and I'll admit there's a degree to this that might be somewhat wishful thinking, but the notion that forced to replace Sam Pittman now gives you the freedom to do what maybe Kirby Smart should have been considering doing all along, which is alter some of the offensive philosophy that kept Georgia from maybe reaching its full potential this year. I'm not going to try to oversell this and say, Pittman being gone now, that's a good thing. I'm not going to say that, but his absence does provide an opportunity, because now you get to have a more wide-ranging conversation about how you want to fill the void left behind by his absence. It is a bit of a blank canvas to kind of paint the picture that you want the future of the Georgia offense to look like, and I think it'd be a mistake for Kirby Smart to not use that opportunity to make Georgia a little bit more like LSU going forward. Not a carbon copy of a Big 12 offense. That's not necessarily what I want Georgia to be. But when you see the results of this season, when you see how outmanned Georgia was on Saturday, it seems really hard for me to understand how one wouldn't draw the conclusion that Georgia needs to be a little bit different. And now that Pittman is gone, the opportunity to make those differences happen, John, it just seems to be right there out in front of you now, does it not?
It needs to be. Georgia needs to address the fact that the offense was inept at times this year, and The bar has been raised, and I'm grateful for it. But with that comes higher expectations, and the offense performance towards the end of this year begged for more. And yes, Sam Pittman's loss is a weighty one for this team, but change would need to be made no matter whether he's coming back or not. And I question the meld of the old school. We need big old bodies, and we're going to put them in a phone booth and bang on them. And the schemes that we're running, I mean, we're in shotgun one back out of 11 personnel. 75% of the snaps that are taken now. So how much can you utilize that big lean on them mentality that we somewhat want to embrace, but not fully? I mean, with the packages that we run, I don't get it. I don't get how the two work hand in hand. So, yes, whether Coach Pittman was going to be back, and obviously now he is not, change has to be made. I mean, you got to find ways to attack defenses, and the way we deployed our offense just wasn't what we needed if we're going to play for national championships and be on the level that LSU seems to be.
And let me make one thing very clear. When I say that Georgia needs offensive changes, to me, that's not code language for Georgia should definitely fire James Coley. I think everything ought to be considered. But, John, I'll fully grant that there is a scenario in which that Coley still has value to Georgia in some role. He's a terrific recruiter. He's been a part of a coaching staff that has largely been successful, even if this year the end results kind of fall short. This is not, to me, a pound my fist on the table thing and say James Coley's head needs to be on the chopping block. I think that Georgia should consider every move that it can make to get where it needs to go, but this is not an obvious scenario to me where Coley needs to be the scapegoat for all this because frankly, I think for the most part, Coley, like Jim Chaney before him, is simply executing the philosophy put in place by Kirby Smart here. So there's more than one way, I think, to get new offensive ideas. Sometimes that's bringing in someone to work alongside James Coley. Sometimes that's freeing up James Coley to maybe do the more pure version of what he thinks the best offensive game plan for Georgia would be. Or maybe there is a chance that it's, hey, someone else has just greater stature to convince Kirby Smart to run things this way, whereas a guy like Coley is not going to succeed in changing Kirby's mind. So I think there's a lot of scenarios in terms of how you become different that ought to be considered. But to be clear, I'm not necessarily looking to scapegoat James Coley for everything that was wrong with the Georgia offense this season.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. Coley should receive some of the credit and blame for what the offense was able to do this year, and as well as Coach Pittman. I don't know if it was in his title, but run game coordinator usually falls on the shoulders of a veteran offensive line coach, which I'm sure Coach Pittman had. If it wasn't in title, he had his hands throughout the run game of what was planned each week and the ways to attack a defense. So you have to do more. You just have to do more offensively than what Georgia was able to do this year. And I think that was only highlighted and exacerbated when you're faced against an LSU team that's able to put up points. Candidly, LSU's got a good defense. They're not great. And Georgia's offense made them look really great on Saturday. So it's going to be one of those off seasons where you look at everything. You turn over every stone, from a player to the coach as to what needs to be done to be more effective. I mean, your job as an offense is to score points and protect the football. And I think we were able to check one of those boxes pretty consistently, but putting points on the board sometimes became a real difficulty that it needs to be addressed.
In the time we have left, I want to talk about specifically the game from Saturday. Quick word from Kroger before that. We're coming up on a great celebration. It's 12 days worth of ho, ho, ho. A lot of savings. I'll use my Santa Claus voice to try to give you that. Kroger's got you covered for 12 days of Merry here. To opt in to receive these savings, text 12 Merry, that's 12 Merry like Merry Christmas, to this number, 99894. 99894. Text 12MARY to 99894, and you can start getting your savings going right now. 12 Days of Mary from Kroger. And by the way, find out more information about this by checking out the top of the page today at DawgNation.com. All right, John, on the SEC championship game, here's what I'll say. Georgia's lost some games in the Smart era, and a couple of them have been pretty convincing losses, right? I mean, LSU last year, Auburn the year before that. However, there was always a way to look at those games and say, you know, this kind of feels like an aberration. This feels like the best version of Georgia didn't quite show up today, and you kind of assume that Georgia would shake that off going forward. For the most part, they just kind of did. This, for me, was the first time in the Smart era where I looked at a Georgia team on the field, and I don't mean to be too harsh here, but Georgia did not belong on that field with LSU. Georgia was having to fight, scratch, claw, do whatever it could from the very beginning just to keep it close. This was veering towards the direction of LSU kind of running off and hiding really for the entirety of the game here. I think there's a magnitude's worth of difference right now between this Georgia team and that LSU team. What did you make of the game and just kind of how Georgia looked in comparison to what a truly elite SEC team looks like here at the end of the 2019 season?
Well, the better team won on Saturday, and I think every Georgia fan came into this game hoping that we would have some miraculous breakthrough offensively, or there's be some amazing occurrence of events. And when you're in that situation, I think it's pretty telling. I think you go up against an LSU team that believes wholeheartedly in what they're doing on both sides of the ball, and there's synergy created, and you have to play your best football against great teams that believe in themselves. And LSU is a great team right now that believes in what they're doing. And Georgia goes out there and doesn't perform well. We didn't have our best game. We missed opportunities. And when you miss opportunities and you give momentum to a team that very capable, I don't want to use the term better than you, but I think you probably could, you're going to struggle, and that's what Georgia did. LSU is the superior opponent on Saturday, and you miss opportunities, and you don't create more opportunities to replace those, and it's going to go the way that it did. That LSU, golly, they continued to maximize. They believed in their identity, and Georgia was floundering, and it's hard to say that because, you know, you walk into that game with 11 wins and you represent the SEC East for a third time in as many years. It's been a good year, but man, did it highlight the difference in what it takes to be on a championship level and where Georgia is right now.
I want to be respectful of your time. I don't want to keep you too long, but I do want to say something back to all of that because I think what you're saying is absolutely spot on. And one of the more, I guess, significant frustrations for me as someone who obviously wants Georgia to win, this was in my mind supposed to be a battle of the physical Georgia versus the finesse LSU, and it's this great debate of, hey, can physicality still beat the finesse version of a team like what LSU's become? But, John, in the early stage of this game defensively, when Georgia's forced to play with 7 defensive backs, which is what they were doing a lot early in some of those early drives for LSU, all of a sudden the identity that we have of Georgia as this physical defense, these incredibly athletic outside linebackers, John, they've been relegated to sitting on the bench. All of a sudden, Georgia's not Georgia. This really looked like if your kid plays like flag football and, you know, you have one of those kinds of situations going on, it looks like Georgia's playing flag football defense, LSU is playing flag football offense with like 9,000 receivers, and Georgia defensively forced to put 9,000 defensive backs out there. You got everybody essentially running routes. It's like a Thanksgiving football game. You know, the physicality of Georgia was just completely neutralized by LSU's offensive firepower. So in this ongoing debate of how much does Georgia need to change, maybe the most significant data point for why it does need to change is the thing that makes Georgia, when you play a team like LSU here in 2019, suddenly it seems like you don't get to use any of that stuff because of the way that LSU forces you to just put different personnel in the game.
Well, yeah, when you go up against a team that is multifaceted as LSU, you cannot do just one thing. You can't bring 6 every time. You can't bring pressure every time. You're going to have to mix it up. And I think the one play that probably sticks out in my mind, and I'm not alone in this, is that first touchdown where Joe Burrow's running around back there for 12 seconds and is able to find a receiver. And against the defense that it says they're rushing 3. Watch that play again. Who's rushing? We've got maybe one pass rusher and 2 other guys standing looking to what? Bat a pass down?
Yeah.
So you give a talented team that much time, it doesn't matter. We could have the best defensive backs. You could have Jalen Ramsey and Marcus Peters out there, and they're going to find a way to get open. I mean, it's just not realistic to expect your defensive backs to lock them down for 8 seconds at a time. So that's part of it. Now, the other side of this coin is when you're facing a historically relevant, accurate quarterback, and Joe Burrow is, I think he finished the season with a completion rate of like 78% of his passes are completed. You need to be aware that if you bring pressure, he's going to find a receiver that's open and not just chunk the ball away. So it's a mixed bag. And I think that's what Georgia's plan was, is we want to show them a variety of looks. We're going to have to play coverage sometimes, and sometimes we're going to bring the heat. But we've got to play the hand that was dealt us. And honestly, this was my concern going into the game. You go up against LSU, you get down early, and Georgia did. That is a miserable spot to put your defense in, because they're stuck between, do we press more to try to create turnovers because our offense needs it, or are we going to play the game plan that we wanted to coming into this game? And I think Georgia kind of got caught in the middle against a buzzsaw offense that feels very capable against whatever you throw them. So I still think Georgia's got a great defense. It was a miserable spot for them to be in all game against a very talented team, and they didn't get the other side of that coin picked up by the offensive side of the ball and allowing them to play the game that they'd like to play. So, it just showed how outmatched you can be in that scenario, going up against a very capable and just dangerous offense.
I want to squeeze one final thing in on a happier note. We had a chance on Friday to see some of the video of an event that you were part of on Thursday. A lot of the SEC rivals kind of teaming up for a good cause, community service project there in the Atlanta area, and it was fun to be able to hear Tim Tebow talk about that, DJ Shockey talk about that. Your brother Matt was good enough to share some of the details of kind of what went on there on Thursday. And John, I know you were a part of that. We showed some video on Friday on our show of kind of some of y'all, kind of doing some of that work, and I think it's a pretty good reminder of kind of the way we all should be looking to kind of help out in our community, but it's also just kind of a fun thing to see. A lot of guys we're used to seeing playing against each other, Tebow, the Florida guy, a lot of Georgia guys out there kind of working towards the same cause. How much fun is that for you to still be a part of stuff like that and be able to kind of share your time with other former SEC greats? I got to imagine that's a pretty fulfilling moment.
Oh, we love it. And, it starts 20 years ago for some of us of that first time on campus, and you got Robert Miles working at the University of Georgia, letting you know the opportunities that come with playing football.
Yeah,
and it's not just for football. It's just a way of life where you recognize we all have a way of and abilities to give back to other folks, and SEC has done a great job in conjunction with Allstate. Every year they provide this opportunity of doing community service and revitalizing a park in the Atlanta area. It's usually in conjunction with the Boys and Girls Club. And we all jump at the chance.
Sure.
It's the same group primarily each year that gets to go out there and represent the SEC and work alongside some volunteers from Allstate, and usually the SEC commissioner joins us.
Nice.
And just represent in a way that makes everybody feel like we can make a difference and we can give back. And it's just a cool opportunity for all of us to get involved and get your hands a little dirty and do it in a way that makes you feel good at the end of the day.
Well, John, I think that's well said, and I appreciate you setting that standard, and it's a great example for all of us to follow. We also appreciate your time here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Georgia United Credit Union. Your insight on the game and kind of where Georgia goes from here is certainly invaluable for us, and so thanks for sharing that time with us. We'll look forward to getting a chance to hopefully speak with you again here soon as well.
Oh, it's always fun, BA. It's been a great year of talking Bulldog football with you and just with the Dog Nation. And, at the end of the day, the SEC championship didn't go the way we wanted it to, but, man, I'd much rather be a Bulldog today than a Gator or a Tiger or a Volunteer any day of the week, man. So it's always great to be a Bulldog.
Could not have said it better myself, John. Thanks for your time.
Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
We love John Stinchcomb around here, and that is a great way to close that conversation now. That even on a not great day for Georgia, still better than being one of those lousy, stinking Gators. I can promise you that. And I will say this, too. We talk about the game. When you cover, and I use cover in air quotes because I don't, I'm a little bit different than one of the embedded reporters. I'm not in Athens every single day. But when you're covering SEC football, you see a lot of amazing players. And so the notion of being dazzled by any individual player, that just doesn't happen all that much because they're all good, right? All the Georgia players are good. The opponent, they've all got really good players. It's just the nature of SEC football. I will say that Joe Burrow, man, is something different. And he's got enough people praising him. I'm not going to spend too much time blowing up how good he is. He's even better than I realized. And he is exponentially better than he was when Georgia played that team last October. It's really pretty amazing. And everybody's got their own comparison for kind of who he is, when he reminds you of. The only thing, having been in the building to see him, that it kind of makes me feel like was, I was, lucky enough to see Aaron Rodgers play a couple times in person. The playoff game a few years ago when Green Bay beat the Falcons in the year that the Packers won the Super Bowl, I believe that's Rodgers' only Super Bowl win. In that year, seeing him in person and watching the way that he kept plays alive with his feet, and he was almost this like magical player. And I'm not telling you that Joe Burrow is the comp for Aaron Rodgers or that the career that Rodgers has had is the one that Burrow is going to have. But watching the kind of just sort of futile effort to do anything to shut him down was, to me, very Aaron Rodgers-esque on Saturday. That is one of those guys it's very easy to sort of tip your cap to and say, on this particular day, you were the better player. And really, one of the best I've seen in person at the college level. I'm just telling you, I had no idea that Joe Burrow would be the kind of guy I'd say that about, but I don't know of a quarterback I've seen in person that was better in the game than I saw him in than what Burrow was on Saturday. So do with that what you will. We'll go cruiser in the SEC. It's courtesy of Royal Caribbean, and if you didn't need a vacation before this weekend, I know you need one now, and my recommendation for you would be one of the great ships in the fleet at Royal Caribbean. They celebrate turning 50 years bold this year. One of the ways they're celebrating that is by amplifying some of the ships in their fleet, some of the ones that maybe you've been on in the past, bigger and better than ever before, like the Oasis of the Seas. They've added the tallest water slide at sea. You've heard me talk about that before. They call it Ultimate Abyss. It's like an amazing experience to go firing down a water slide on the side of a cruise ship. That's just a cool thing. Also, lots of family entertainment for your kids, or, kind of cool things for like that significant other. If it's like a couple situation, they've added like a bunch of bars. There's a sports bar there now. It's called Playmaker Sports Bar and Arcade. They've got the Lime and Coconut, which is like 3 stories tall. It's like one of those really cool tropical bars, except it's right there on the cruise ship. It's really amazing, all the amenities these ships have, and Royal Caribbean's been setting the standard on that for 50 years. So go to RoyalCaribbean.com, find out more about the Oasis of the Seas, but also get in touch with a travel advisor. They can help you book the vacation that I know you need. All right, let's talk about Mike Bobo for a minute. And I guess it's David Cloninger, who's a friend of ours here on DawgNation Daily. He's been on our show before for the Charleston Post and Courier, who initially broke the story that Bobo was expected to become South Carolina offensive coordinator. There was some scuttlebutt after that of maybe it's not a done deal, kind of whatever else. You've got the guy from The Athletic, who's also a really good reporter. saying now that I guess on Tuesday the board is expected to meet and give approval for the hire of an offensive coordinator, which we all assume is going to be Mike Bobo going to South Carolina. Now, in the midst of this, there's always the rumor mill stuff that kind of pops up for, well, maybe Georgia can swoop in and sort of save this at the last minute, maybe even making the comparison to what happened back in 2016 when Georgia swooped in to get Kirby Smart as head coach before it was thought that South Carolina might be doing that. This, to me, kind of always reminds me of the same thing that I bring up, that the appetite for information never goes down. And on a day when Georgia got some bad news, the appetite for good information is even higher. So something's always going to sort of step in an attempt to fill that void, and rumors of Georgia behind the scenes trying to get Mike Bobo, that just sort of feels like a good way to kind of fill that void between the availability information and the appetite for that information. Now, it may be true that things with South Carolina aren't quite as done and buttoned up as maybe some expected that it would be, or maybe some that reported that it would be. That may be true. What's not apparent, though, is if Georgia's even trying to do anything about that. It's very easy to want to connect the dots between Bobo, who I believe is a good offensive mind, his alma mater, Georgia, who could use the helping hand provided by a good offensive mind. But it's just not obvious this story is that Georgia is involved in this story in any way whatsoever. South Carolina may be on the verge of hiring Bobo, and if that indeed goes down, I think it's bad news for Georgia. I think that you look at Will Muschamp, good defensive guy, good recruiter for the most part, but over the course of his career has just not quite had that offensive coordinator to help balance things out. If it is Bobo in Columbia, that changes, and according to some reports coming out of Columbia, that could indeed be on its way to happening. Maybe by tomorrow, that could be done. So we'll follow it and see where it goes. A couple other stories to get to here as part of cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. So Lane Kiffin has been officially announced as Ole Miss coach. There was the funny moment, and I don't have this video to play for you, but where as he's like kissing babies and greeting folks right down the tarmac in Oxford, one of the people that was shaking his hand, congratulating him on getting the job, kind of casually said, "Hey, Lane, get your burner phone." Obviously a reference to, I don't even know what, sort of the colorful rumor mill that's sort of always attached to Lane Kiffin. So things with Kiffin in Oxford are already off to kind of a rousing start, apparently. This is going to be quite an entertaining thing to watch. And in a roundabout way, the Kiffin story also kind of ties back to the Georgia situation, because I think it's really the pressure, because there had been some rumors that Arkansas was trying to get in on Lane Kiffin there as well. The fact that Ole Miss kind of outflanks Arkansas for Kiffin, and the fact that another story that's out there that Eli Drinkwitz, a coach that admittedly I don't know that much about, but obviously Appalachian State was a really good team this year. Missouri, who is Arkansas's geographic border rival, kind of right there in those Ozark Mountains, crossover opponent in the SEC East every year, they step up and hire Drinkwitz, which I think for the most part is going to be celebrated as a really good hire. I mean, my gosh, he beat an SEC team this year. He beat South Carolina, so that's a pretty good hire. So the Kiffin story actually involves Georgia. The Drinkwitz to Missouri story kind of involves Georgia, because it's all about the pressure that Arkansas felt to make some sort of coaching announcement, given the fact that their job had been open longer than these other schools, and they were just kind of getting outmaneuvered for various coaches. They had to do something. That's why Sam Pittman kind of became that guy there. So y'all have heard me say this before. I love coaching rumor mill season. Admittedly, I like it a little bit less when some of those rumors involve guys potentially leaving Georgia, but we are in the midst of what's going to be a wild next few days. Some of it will involve the Dogs, some of it won't, just like yesterday. Some of it has, some of it hasn't. And we'll follow it and see where it goes. But Lane Kiffin's back in the SEC. Programs trying to get better. The programs who were on top, Georgia included, trying to hold on to the things that have made them the programs that they are, trying to protect their advantage over the rest of this league. It is kind of the silly season of college football, and it is going to be as entertaining and wild this year as it ever was. We'll make that cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Georgia United Credit Union, I want to turn my attention fully back to Georgia for a moment. And I want to talk about something that Kirby Smart said about the Sugar Bowl yesterday. And there is a way for a certain college football fan to read what Smart's about to say here and not lament the state of the Dogs program, but lament the state of college football, that this is how much things have eroded in terms of what we used to hold dear, what we used to value. And someone like me, who admittedly can be a bit resistant to change, you hear a quote like this and it kind of sends you in that direction. However, I think the ultimate takeaway on this is maybe slightly different. Smart asked about the Sugar Bowl during a teleconference yesterday. I wasn't a part of it. Mike Griffith was there, and he wrote about this at DawgNation.com. Smart asked about the motivation of the Sugar Bowl and the thought that DeAndre Baker didn't play in the game last year. Maybe some other Georgia players weren't all that keen on being there a year ago. That was at least the assumption. Smart was asked about that and gave a very direct response. Let me read this to you from him. He says, what I found last year was that for a lot of kids, it, meaning the Sugar Bowl, was the most important game of their season and meant so much to them. You could think about a guy like Azeez Ojulari or maybe Devon Wilson being examples of that because they were coming back after injury. Smart goes on to say, then maybe for some others it didn't. You've got to take the guys that are engaged and excited about playing because that matters a whole lot more than how good they are. That's Kirby Smart. You can read more on him about the Sugar Bowl there at DawgNation.com. Here is my simple takeaway on this. I'll say a little bit about this now, and I think I'm going to say a whole lot more about this tomorrow. I think what Smart says there, even if you don't like the current state of college football that causes him to need to say that, I think Smart's honesty is refreshing. And to be completely honest myself, honesty is something we need from Smart just a little bit more. I thought it was really telling in the post-game press conference on Saturday that when Smart was asked about how healthy DeAndre Swift was in the game, Smart kind of hemmed and hawed and eventually said, to me, he was fine. Did anybody watch that game on Saturday and think DeAndre Swift is fine? But even after we all saw with our own eyes, Smart still couldn't let it be known that, yes, the game plan was altered because of the fact that DeAndre Swift wasn't fully healthy. There's just a lot sometimes that comes from Smart that doesn't seem to match up with what we see with our own eyes. At least in this case, when it comes to the Sugar Bowl, Smart says, yeah, some guys last year didn't want to be there, and we've got to figure out who wants to be there this year. That's not pleasant, but it is the truth. And moving forward on issues involving Georgia, I think Dog fans deserve the truth. All right, we'll wrap up here, and I loved what John Stinchcomb said a little earlier on our program, that a bad day for a dog is still better than the best day of being a Gator. And with that in mind, remind those Florida fans, 1,136 days. That's how long it's been since the lousy, stinking Gators have beaten the Georgia Bulldogs, and we'll keep counting that all throughout the year. It's our Gator Hater Updater right here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Georgia United Credit Union. And then on a slightly different note to finish things up, I know you always read Good Day UGA at DawgNation.com. Today I thought was an incredibly poignant day to read that. Touching story from our buddy Connor Riley about a friend that he's recently lost. And I think what you see when you read this, and I hope that you'll read it for yourself, there's no better skill in life than being a good friend. Pretty clearly Connor is one. I know he is to me and others as well. There's no better scoreboard for how you're doing in life than the number of friends you have. And certainly we're with our friend Connor here as he deals with a loss. I'll invite you to read his story more at DawgNation.com, and we'll see all of you again tomorrow. And on video, time now for our R.S. Andrews cool down, and I'll just briefly say this as well. We value privacy here, so if Connor wants to talk more about this on the air, he's certainly free to, but you can read more about the friend that he lost at DawgNation.com, and I thought it was good that Connor kind of told a story that's personal to him. And obviously, I've gotten to know Connor very, very well, and a lot of you have gotten to know him well through the magic of streaming video and the internet. And like anybody that when there's a loss, you feel a loss for them. And obviously, Connor's been dealing with that this weekend. So sorry to hear that for him. But so thankful for his contribution to DawgNation, and really appreciative of the fact that Connor was willing to be vulnerable in the pages of DawgNation.com in the midst of a busy time where he's trying to cover, everything else that's kind of going on in the college football world. To take some time to kind of share the feelings that he felt, I think we're all better for that. So that's my piece on that. And with that said, I'll kind of transition in here and we'll talk about the matter at hand. And I want to say one thing to our video audience before we kind of move on with our R.S. Andrews cool down and kind of get busy with these comments. I promised you all that if this season did not go the way that we wanted it to go, and I say that as someone who's a Georgia partisan, that we would give the "See, I told you so" crowd, we'd give them their chance to do that. And unfortunately, I got to sort of make good on that promise. Now, we're not going to wallow in misery. We're not going to do that. We're just not. But to a degree, do you have to give the people that could never fully buy in this year, do you have to give them their moment? I think it's only fair to do that a bit. Because what my bargain was with people, and not everybody accepted the bargain, but what my bargain was with people, when Georgia was sputtering but winning to let's enjoy the ride. Let's see if Georgia plays well when it matters. And if it doesn't, we'll deal with it then. Well, then is now. And it needs to be dealt with. And as I said off the top of the program, it's actually fairly easy to do a kind of an optimistic, hopeful show because that's my sort of default position in life. Life is good. Just being alive is a good thing. I have an optimistic point of view on life as it is. It also works out pretty well that I get to talk about a team that for the most part is the envy of most of the rest of college football. However, I don't ever want to just sort of spoon feed you some make-believe version of what the actual facts on the ground are. Georgia needs to improve, and most of that improvement needs to occur offensively because defense is not going to win a national championship in 2019. David Pollack, our buddy from ESPN College Game Day, obviously the great former UGA defensive player, made that abundantly clear when he spoke to us on Friday, and I'm sure you saw that as part of our Road to Atlanta video coverage. So with all that said, I'm sort of wide open for everyone to take it. We're not going to wallow in misery. We're not going to trash people. We're not going to do stuff like that. But if you want to have kind of a sort of unfettered free-for-all here for a couple of minutes, I think some of you have earned the right to do that. So it's our RS Andrews cool down. Get the $99 furnace safety check. It's, as I said before, it's just $99. It'll give you the peace of mind that your heating system is ready to go to make its way through the winter and that it's safe because, after all, something that heats up your house also has to get pretty warm to do the things that it needs to do. So make sure that's as safe as it needs to be. And with that said, we'll get your comments on YouTube first, then Facebook after that, and we'll have a good little window of time here for you to do what you want to do. Ronald Watson says you need to admit that Fromm is the problem. So, Ronald, here's what I'll say. I think it's unfair. And we're going to talk about Jake on the show this week, not just in the comment section. We're going to talk about him on the show this week. And one of the things I'm going to say tomorrow is I think Kirby Smart made a real mistake by once again on Saturday focusing the attention for why the Georgia offense wasn't any better on the wide receivers. That's obviously partially true, but it is certainly fair to say that this was a year in which Fromm really didn't get better and he may have regressed. Now, I've seen Jake Fromm be a good quarterback before, so I'm going to make the logical assumption that he's still a good quarterback who maybe just had less of a season than I wanted him to have, than he himself probably wanted to have. I've seen him be good before. He's not suddenly not a good quarterback, but it was not a great year for Jake Fromm. I think that's right. I think that Kirby Smart, in some of the remarks that he's made, again on Saturday, but throughout the season, has tied himself in too many knots as a way of saying, well, the actual problem for Georgia's offense is not the center of it all, Jake Fromm. It's actually this thing over here like the wide receivers, or this or that or the other. And as much as it pains me to say this, there was a former Florida player who said something pretty telling on Twitter. Now, I don't want this to be true, but I think you have to give it a little bit of credence. That what the former Florida guy said, that Kirby Smart's always casting blame when things don't go well. You may save your quarterback when you defend him in a press conference, but if defending your quarterback puts the blame on other players in the roster, and if that happens too much, what eventually happens is that you lose some degree of trust within the team. And I think that Kirby Smart's defense of Fromm and defense of the offense has veered too much this year towards the blame the wide receivers. And that's not to say that the receivers have been blameless. They deserve a portion of the blame. But if we drew a circle, and that circle represented the pie that is the Georgia offense, we started cutting up pieces of who takes the blame. Smart's offensive philosophy, James Coley's play calling, Jake Fromm's execution, the wide receivers. I believe that the picture that's been drawn publicly is too big of a piece of that blame on the receivers. Even though they've obviously struggled in some key situations, it's been obvious that some of those guys did not get the job done. But their public share of the blame, I believe, is too big. Fromm's public share of the blame, I believe, has been too small. That's not to say that, all of a sudden now I've decided that Jake Fromm's not a good quarterback anymore, but I don't believe, in terms of the official position of Georgia, the things spoken out of Kirby Smart's mouth, I don't believe he's given enough blame to Jake Fromm. I don't. Valance says James Coley is told to call by Kirby Smart, and that goes back to Valance's what we've talked about a lot, that there is a philosophy in place that might not make it matter who the offensive coordinator is. Coley now, Jim Chaney before, somebody else in the future, depending on how things were to shake out. It's the overarching philosophy that determines, how all this plays out. I think that's probably true. Fisha08, thanks for checking in. Tristan J checking in to say the receivers weren't great this year, but Fromm missed a bunch of wide open receivers. He's part of the blame. And Tristan, what I wish that what we could do is, and this is so hard to do in a format like this, sports talk in general does not favor nuance, but your last sentence to me is the most true thing anyone's going to say. That receivers, and you can call someone by name if you want to, receivers, part of the blame. Quarterback, part of the blame. So-and-so, part of the blame. That's not my way of equivocating and basically saying it's everybody's default, everybody's at fault, nothing's too specific. No, I'm not trying to soften the message. I'm trying to, I guess, contextualize the message that everyone being to blame means everyone needs to share in that responsibility. Go back to the pie chart thing. If you want to draw this for the quarterback, this piece for the wide receivers, whatever's inside that piece is the responsibility of the people in that piece. And you can make a case that everyone within there, what's the old Bill Belichick mantra of do your job? Everybody we're going to discuss, play caller, head coach, quarterback, receivers, even offensive line and running backs maybe. Everybody within that, you can make a case that could have done their job better. And as I said before, some of y'all think that I'm not hard enough on Fromm. Part of the reason why that is because you can go back and watch all these videos from the entire season, from every year we've been doing DawgNation Daily. I'm not going to come on here and trash these guys. I'm not going to do that. I'm just not. It's tacky. I'm not going to do that. So I think there's a way of having a real conversation about real facts that doesn't veer into the direction of just absolutely castigating people. That's just not my thing. I just think I think there's a better way to do it than that. But if you want to start holding people accountable and being careful that one group or one player does end up shouldering too much of the blame on a day like this in a aftermath of the game on Saturday, I absolutely think that's fair. Absolutely think that's fair. We'll get a few more of your comments. Let me go to Facebook here. Clay Dyke says getting Theo Johnson would help, and the Theo Johnson announcement is slated to come later on this afternoon between 1:30 and 2 p.m. Eastern time. So we'll follow it and see where it goes. Keelan Susan Richter says, what names are you hearing for the offensive line coach? Obviously, you don't have to look very far to find some online chatter about big names that could be coming in, and you almost wonder, is this an example of, hey, I go back to the same thing I've said before about availability of information compared to the desire for information. People want to believe that a big name is going to step in right away to fill the shoes for a guy like Pittman's departure, and you don't have to look very far to see some of those big names that have been kind of kicked around on message boards or Twitter or something like that. For me, I think it's too early to tell on something of that nature, but obviously when it comes to things like this, Georgia's going to be looking to make that move pretty quickly. Gina Sheffield says, so many injuries. Are we overworking our guys during practice? I don't know that Georgia was any more injured than any other team is. I think that sometimes injuries are just a function of bad luck, right? I mean, Blaylock going down the way that he did. I just don't know that there's anything that can be done to prevent that. It's just bad luck. And you hate it for any Georgia player, especially for a guy like Blaylock who's worked as hard as he has this year. And you can cite the DeAndre Swift stuff there as well. I don't know that there's all that much can be done from a preventative standpoint to keep something like that from happening. I just think it is to a degree bad luck. James Crump says Kirby Smart's decision-making on quarterbacks is what failed us. I mean, listen, everything's on the table right now. I definitely think it's a bad look for Georgia that Fields will be playing in the college football playoff while Georgia's not. I think that is. Now, I think the real stories oftentimes in life are a little bit more complicated than that, and it's not as cut and dry as, well, Kirby Smart picked the wrong one. But if Smart was going to bring in Fields, and he did for the class of 2018, then I think he had an obligation to himself to manage Fields a little bit better than he did. And it's not great for Kirby that Ryan Day has immediately been able to utilize Fields as a superstar, whereas, Kirby Smart, treated him like a curiosity. I think that's not a great comparison. And it's a more complicated situation overall than just a couple sentences can define it as. But that's on the table right now. It's absolutely on the table. Ray June Johnson says about some of the situation with the receivers, and it was devastating for me that Georgia makes the deep throw to start the game, and kind of as a microcosm of the rest of the season, Simmons is just not quite able to make that catch, even though to me it looked like he was open. To me, it looked like it was a good throw, and the catch just was not quite able to be made. Matt Lander's going to find himself in a similar situation late in the game where it seems like he had a touchdown. It seemed like the throw was there. Not every throw that Jake made on Saturday was perfect, admittedly, but it seemed like that particular throw was there, and just not able to convert, just not able to come up with it. And those were guys that I think that Georgia fans have kind of bought into. Of you got to have somebody step up. As much as I love George Pickens, he put his team in a bad spot by not being available in the first half. You have to be honest about that. The Lawrence Cager injury kind of forced Georgia to return back to some guys that some Georgia fans had grown tired of, and Georgia showed confidence in some of those players all season long, and some of those receivers just didn't show up when Georgia needed them to on Saturday. That's just part of the truth of this. It is. Charles Ward says Simmons was wide open on that play, and I know he hates it for himself, but it was not a good situation because Georgia trusted him, and it didn't quite come up. Frank DiCarlo on the subject of deleted tweet. There's going to be a lot of that right now. We talked to LeCount on Saturday after the game, and he emphatically said that he planned on playing in the bowl game. So I'd be careful with tweets getting deleted, what they might mean, what they might not mean. That's true for the good and for the bad. There was a Georgia player who yesterday tweeted a big positive message, and there was a way to read into that of saying, well, all right, here we go. And I think sometimes even that, we have a tendency to attach meaning sometimes to things that might not quite have it there. So, I'm always looking for social media for clues about what might be going on in any situation, but we've also got to be really careful that some things for the negative don't quite mean what you think they mean. Some things for the positive necessarily don't quite mean what you think they mean. Jacob O'Neill says Pickens is going to be a bad man next year. Yeah, that's one of the interesting things about Pickens in the second half. For the most part, the game had already been decided, but he came in and showed you what he kind of brings to the table. Catches a touchdown. He makes a catch and makes the leaping move to avoid being tackled. There is nothing about Fields' profile. There's nothing about Pickens' profile that involves athleticism that makes you wonder how good he's going to be. Athletically, we know he's got it. We know he's ready to go. There may be some other things that he's still dealing with, and we did not get a chance to talk to him after the game on Saturday. I think he was getting some medical treatment of some kind after the game, so at least I never saw him in the Georgia locker room when I was in there. But we know that whatever is going to determine the story of how good Pickens ends up being, it's not ability. It's not on-field stuff. He's already shown in his freshman season that he's got that. Maybe more so than any freshman receiver in America. He brings that to the table. He's got some other things that he's going to have to answer for, and I'm sure he'll be eager this offseason to do the work necessary to do that. Bob Garrison mentions Matt Luke as a possible replacement for Sam Pittman. That's an example of one of those easy dots to connect. Luke is a big personality, maybe similar to Pittman in some way. It's not the exact carbon copy, but at least similar. It's a name people would know. That's a name that makes Georgia fans feel pretty good. So the thing you have to wonder is this one of those things sort of like Bobo to Georgia where it kind of becomes a part of the rumor mill because it just seems so obvious? Or would there potentially really be something there for that? I think when it comes to those big names, whether it's Luke or a guy like even the Tech offensive line guy, Brent Key or something like that, sometimes those names kind of pop up in the rumor mill because it's the kind of thing that, it just seems like such an obvious round peg in a round hole type scenario. So, yeah, we'll have to wait and see on that. Obviously, I think that Luke, if it were a guy like that, would be welcomed by most Georgia fans. I think it'd be the kind of guy that could calm the nerves of some of the Georgia offensive linemen. He's just a respected dude. But sometimes these things that sort of sound perfect on paper have a way of not quite materializing much that same way. Let's get a few more. Gary Holt on the subject of Georgia not being able to run the not being able to run the ball. Yeah, that was obviously something that Kirby Smart talked about even Saturday, and I think one of the things that maybe Smart doesn't want to fully discuss is the ways in which defenses being able to predict what Georgia was going to do made it even harder for Georgia to run. when you're able to put 7 guys in a box, when you're able to do, things like that, that just made it harder for Georgia, just made it more difficult for Georgia to be able to run the ball. And, we'll never know how the running game would have been different if the offense overall had been a little bit different. Haley Gubala, and I hope I pronounced your last name, Haley, correct, says that how is Blaylock's injury? So it has been officially confirmed as an ACL. That means a road to recovery now for Blaylock, which is a tough thing. So you hate that for him. You do. You hate that for him. So, but I know he's a tough guy, and I'm sure he's going to be working hard to get back. Cliff Hancock on Facebook says, this has been a negative news episode, LOL. Give us a feel-good news story. So, yeah, Cliff, I try to address that because obviously I'm kind of a positive guy. Georgia's kind of a fun team to talk about. It's very easy to do kind of a happy, feel-good show because for the most part, life is great, and for the most part, we all get to watch a really good team and a really successful program. So it's really easy to do a happy show like 99 days out of 100. But the one thing that I'm not going to do, though, is have a Sam Pittman situation pop up and sort of shrug my shoulders and say, well, that's okay. Georgia's got an even better offensive line coach, and he'll be here tomorrow. Or see Georgia come up short in a game like this against LSU and say, that's okay. Wait till next year. Georgia's going to win all 15 of them by 40 points. Now, all those things may end up being true. Georgia's a good program. The idea of there being better days ahead seems like a fairly confident certainty. But in order to get to that better place, in order to get to that better new spot, I think I've got a certain obligation to treat you with respect. Your intelligence, your your understanding of the situation. I'm not going to come on here and tell you that things are one way when with your own eyes you can obviously see that there's another. So if you want the good news, it's this. We heard this from Milton, from Kyle Sherman's camp, from Marcus Roseman a little earlier in the program. A lot of these guys are just absolutely still as much in love with Georgia as ever before. And Georgia, one way or another, is going to be a contender once again in 2020. So the world's not coming to an end. Georgia's time near the top of the SEC is not coming to an end. But maintaining that position and improving means navigating the current situation that Georgia finds itself. So that is my optimistic assessment of the realistic situation, the current facts as they kind of go down. And I think Connor Riley's going to join us here for a couple minutes. We'll let him kind of come in on this too. I mean, Connor, do you get where I'm coming from on this? That there's obviously still good news to talk about, and Georgia's not going to get relegated to the Sun Belt, but it is a reality that Pittman's a big loss, and it's a reality that Georgia did not play well on Saturday, and finding the good news, I think, means processing the reality along the way. Am I wrong for saying it that way?
Yeah. Right as our show started today, Jeff Sintel popped up a story on the sort of effect that Sam Pittman's departure is going to have on the recruiting front, and I suggest you go read it. And I know we're out here, there are people who want good news. The reality is this is it's been a tough weekend. This is kind of the thing you have to deal with when your program just gets embarrassed like it did on Saturday. And I think Arkansas sort of sees Sam Pittman as their Ed Ogeron, a guy who knows the area, who knows the schools, an elite recruiter, great position coach, can relate to guys. And the key there is going to be one, hiring great coordinators and putting them around him, and two, giving him time because Ogeron did pretty well his first year. I believe they won 8-9 games. His second year they got to a New Year's Six Bowl and the Fiesta Bowl. And then this year, you see what they did there. This Arkansas team is a long way away. People thought Chad Morris was going to be able to turn around. He actually somehow put the school even somehow further behind the rest of the SEC. But this is just it's a tough couple of days, and I think the Bobo news is a little disappointing. I know Jeff Schultz of The Athletic, he in his headline said that's who Georgia should go get, and now that it doesn't look like that's going to happen. There's a lot of unknown, and there's sort of this idea of Kirby's got to make a change, but is Kirby going to be sort of willing enough to admit that his philosophy on things is not correct in today's college football world?
So let me go. I want to take a lot more comments, but let me go kind of rapid fire with you for a moment on a few things. I'm going to give you a chance to give a simple answer to some simple questions. Mm-hmm. I absolutely believe that Georgia needs offensive changes, but I'm going to stop short of saying that Georgia definitely needs to fire James Coley. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I don't think firing Coley. I've said all year I don't think Coley was the issue.
Yeah. I don't think that Kirby Smart has given enough public blame to Jake Fromm. I thought that continued on Saturday. Do you agree with that?
Probably, yeah. I think if you ask Jake, he would admit that he has to be better.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's Kirby shielding him because Jake probably gets maybe more unfair criticism than he deserves. But Jake is as much. Saturday it was from watching from the field. It was very clear. Jake, in my estimation, was as much an issue as the wide receivers.
And to be clear, my reason for saying that's not because I want to see Jake drag through the mud, and it's not because I don't think of him as a top flight quarterback. I think he was a top flight quarterback who didn't quite have the great season that I expect him to have. My point is when Smart goes out of his way on Saturday, and we're going to talk more about this on the show tomorrow. When he goes out of his way to kind of put what I thought was excessive blame on the receivers, even though they did not have a good day on Saturday, I think you may save face for your quarterback, but you run the risk of losing the rest of the locker room.
Right, and if I could say sort of two things. One, Stetson Bennett came into the game on Saturday, and I had seen some people wondering, oh, well, what can Stetson give us? What can Stetson go in the game? It's clear Jake Fromm is several levels above where Bennett is right now. And two, for everyone that brings up Justin Fields, I would just like to restate some things here that I feel like people continually choose to ignore. One, Justin Fields was not better and did not give the 2018 Georgia team a better chance to win a national title last year. I think that became very apparent in the Alabama game when they were inserting him in there. And Jake was having the game of his life, and Fields was rather ineffective before the fake punt even ever happened. Two, Fields chose to leave Georgia. Georgia did not push him out. Georgia wanted him to come back, and the intent was for Fields and Fromm to have an open competition. And Fields chose not to do that. He chose to go ahead and enter the transfer portal so he could get to wherever he felt would need to go next, and that decision has worked out very well for him. Third, for everyone, and I know we sort of talked about this on Saturday, for everyone saying that Fields would make this offense so much better, yes, his running ability would help greatly, but their struggles with this offense and the wide receivers, I don't know how Justin Fields makes the wide receivers that much better and how he sort of overcomes those sort of losses there. So while, I'm not saying Justin Fields isn't a great player, he's certainly proven that this year at Ohio State, but I do think people are sort of losing sight of how everything went down to sort of want to try and fit their narrative, whether it be to throw Kirby, Jake Fromm, whoever under the bus.
All right, so that's good stuff there. Let me get a few more comments here on Facebook. Let me pop over here again.
If I could say one other thing, and I sort of wrote about this morning, when Mark Fox was the basketball coach at Georgia, there'd be a couple of times where, when the team was struggling, he'd choose to bring up, well, we didn't have this player this year that we had for a while. Most famously, he did this with Kentavious Caldwell-Pope for a couple of years. And I always sort of took issue with it because you knew with a guy of Caldwell-Pope's talent that he was never going to stick around long, and you had to know that he was going to leave sooner rather than later, and you had to find a way to replace him. That's just sort of the nature of college basketball. And when I heard Kirby once again bring up that Georgia's put all these wide receivers in the NFL and they don't have these wide receivers anymore, I kind of just, I don't want to say I reached a breaking point, but I find this rhetoric ridiculous in the sense that, so Mecole Hardman was a 5-star recruit. Isaac Nauta was a 5-star recruit. Terry Godwin, you knew, was a senior and was going to be graduating after that last year. Ridley, I can understand. The Jeremiah Holman thing is a separate issue. But you knew these guys were leaving. You knew that you were going to have to replace these guys. And to just continue to say that, we don't have these guys. Well, why don't you? Roquan Smith went to the NFL. Georgia was able to replace him. DeAndre Baker went to the NFL. Georgia was able to replace him. Isaiah Wynn went to the NFL. They were able to replace him. Georgia and every other program out there. Ohio State lost multiple wide receivers to the NFL draft last year. You do not hear them. You do not hear anything about the Ohio State wide receivers and the struggles that they've had this year. This is just the fact of life. And when you are recruiting, and he's done an incredible job recruiting, seemingly every other position, but the fact that the wide receiver core was as bad as it was this year is not a short-term thing. This is a thing that was years in the making. And that falls at the feet of Kirby Smart.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it was frustrating to me to hear, this is going back to Friday in the press conference, he was asked about the changes made offensively by LSU and Alabama, and in reference to Alabama in particular, he said, well, Alabama made their offensive changes because they had all those great wide receivers. But those receivers weren't delivered by elves. I mean, Nick Saban made it a point to go out and recruit Jerry Jeudy and Devontae Smith and Henry Ruggs. They recruited all three of those guys in the same year and then got Jalen Waddle as part of the following recruiting class. This was a concerted effort by Alabama to get better there in that spot. And Georgia has just chosen to have different recruiting priorities. It's just a fact. And now Kirby wants to make it sound like, well, we're running the offense we have based on the players we've got. But those players were recruited because of a specific philosophy that was going to be in place in Georgia. And I think it's just objectively true that receivers are just less important to Kirby Smart than other positions are. And now we're in a time in which receivers matter more in the sport overall than they have before, and Georgia's just kind of behind there in that regard. I mean, listen, we'll take a couple comments and then we'll get ready to get off the air. But, my sort of final point on all this is, I think the biggest indictment of the style that Georgia's chosen to occupy, one that sort of favors physicality, one that favors running the ball and playing defense over other things. I think the biggest indictment of that is when they played the opposite kind of team on Saturday, it was the other team that got to dictate the pace. So if you can't be physical Georgia when the other team doesn't have the capability of matching that physicality, when you can't do that against them, then what's the point of doing it against everybody else? I mean, that to me is the biggest argument for why Georgia needs to look a little bit more these teams that will be playing, I guess with the exception of Baylor, Clemson, LSU, and Ohio State. Georgia looking a little bit more like them in the future. I don't how you come away from this season without thinking that a little bit more similar to what Ryan Day is doing, from what Clemson offensively has been doing, from what LSU's been doing. I don't know how you don't come to the conclusion that Georgia needs to be a little bit more like that, especially given the comparison for both Clemson and Ohio State. Their defenses have not suffered by the offenses being more prolific. So that to me is an argument that sort of argues for itself. It is self-evident.
Yeah, and I think Georgia this year, they essentially tried to be the Oakland A's. They were going to try and zig while everyone else was zagging. The A's, everyone knows them from Moneyball, but in more recent years, they have essentially just gone into the far extremes of we're going to try and hit more home runs than anybody, and we're going to, rely on our relief pitching more than anybody else. And that's won them a lot of regular season games. And then when they get to the postseason, they lose. And that is, I think, sort of what Georgia is looking at right now. With its offensive philosophy of, we're just going to try and wear on you and lean on you for 4 quarters, and just by running the ball continuously and hitting the big plays when we occasionally make them.
All right, we are going to take a few more comments here. Chris Horton says, just got here. Any news on Matt Luke to Georgia? Connor, I'll let you respond to this, but my opinion on this is that Luke is one of those perfect names that sometimes ends up being more about the obviousness of the story than the actual facts of the story. Maybe Matt Luke is going to be the next offensive line coach for Georgia, but this is one of those things that gets conjured up sometimes because it's the biggest name that could potentially be out there, at least at first blush. And, sometimes the round hole doesn't quite fit in the round peg exactly as much as you might think. I have no news on Luke one way or another other than this is an example of the kind of rumor that pops up anytime a program like Georgia has an opening like this.
Right. You mentioned, he appears to be the most obvious candidate. I think he'd probably be the most overqualified offensive line coach in the country. But you look at sort of that second win that Alabama got in its dynasty once Kiffin got there. Another very, very important hire to them was the year before Kiffin got there. Mario Cristobal was hired to be their offensive line coach from 2013 to 2016. He was incredibly overqualified for that job, and the likes of Jonah Williams, Alex Leatherwood, all those big-time guys that they brought in there, that was because of Cristobal, and he sort of kept that offensive line sort of pipeline going there, and you see the success he's now having at Oregon. For him to be an offensive line coach for 4 years and have the sort of pedigree that he had. So it's just, the value of having a great, I think, offensive line coach. And Luke, fits that, I think, well. I personally kind of think he got job there at Ole Miss. They just wanted something newer and shinier and didn't really want to see where Luke could possibly take this program or that program. 2 other names worth mentioning. You mentioned Brent Key a little bit earlier. He does have a relationship with Kirby, but he is at Georgia Tech right now, and he has, I believe, a deeper relationship with that school. Another name I would just throw out there for the sake of throwing out there, Will Friend at Tennessee, an offensive line coach, has a relationship with Kirby as well. went to Georgia, obviously coached here under Mark Richt. I know last year Tennessee came and got Jim Chaney from here. And if that can happen, why can't it certainly happen in reverse?
Somebody asked about the idea that Dale McGee might leave. You know, there's going to be lots of rumors about a lot of Georgia coaches being connected to other jobs. That's just the nature of the beast this time of year. I've always believed that McGee, I mean, if he sat pat, he might get a chance to go be a head coach without having to, like, go through the rigors of being an offensive coordinator. I think it's actually harder to be an offensive coordinator than it is to be a head coach. From that standpoint, especially seeing how this has just worked out for Sam Pittman, I think that McGee might be more bolstered than ever to think that if he hangs around long enough, he may get the job he eventually wants, a lower-level college coaching head position. I'd be surprised if Dale McGee leaves, but that's just my opinion.
I mean, I think for that future, and I certainly think that's something he's capable of doing one day.
Oh, yeah.
He only has to look at Sam Pittman. You know,
exactly.
Pittman had elevated himself to a point where he was a nationally known position coach, which is incredibly difficult to do. And he sort of parlayed that into getting a head coach at Arkansas. And you think, you know, McGee, he was very close to getting the Georgia Southern job a few years ago. They went in a different direction. It was kind of a disaster, I believe, under Tyson Summers, and it took him a while to turn things around there. So, you know, McGee, he's a great asset to the Georgia program. He's a great coach. Just about, you know, every running back, they speak of McGee the same way they speak of Pittman. And, you know, right now I do tend to believe he'll still be on the staff. But if someone wants to make him a head coach, as we see with Pittman, that's a hard thing to turn down.
Zinti Zelo Allen says if Dale McGee leaves, bring back McClendon. Yeah, I mean, look, there's going to be lots of rumors and lots of potential movings around. But and I also think it's in the early stages of a guy leaving. It's easy to want to say that all the dominoes are about to topple and the sky's really going to be falling, to kind of use a bunch of mixed metaphors. But you know, I don't think there's a real strong indication that there's about to be this mass exodus off the Georgia coaching staff. I don't, but we'll obviously follow it and see where it goes. John Arena on the subject of receivers about, you know, Georgia not really recruiting the top 5-star receiver because of the kind of offense Georgia runs. I definitely think that's a factor. And you could look at some examples of that where, you know, Georgia, you know, wasn't quite in on a lot of those guys here as part of the 2020 cycle. Now, late in the process, still have a chance for some very good ones. The Arian Smith conversation, the Jermaine Burton conversation, those are good receivers. So Georgia has a chance to upgrade its receiver position a bit here towards the end of the 2020 cycle. But it is fair to say that recruits are always the first to know about a situation somewhere, and the elite playmakers offensively have seemingly known something about Georgia the last couple of recruiting cycles. Now, Georgia still got George Pickens and Dominic Blaylock. When healthy, is a tremendous prospect there as well. But Georgia, it is just fair to say, has not had as easy a time of recruiting dynamic playmaker as it has other positions. I'm excluding running back here for a moment, but listen, you know, in terms of the numbers Georgia needs, even the running back position's had a couple of misses as of late, you got to say.
Yeah, I think you can pretty plainly point to Tank Bigsby and the way that recruitment sort of played out. You can call that a miss. You can look last year, John Emery Jr., who I would add did not play all that much on Saturday. That was a miss there. You know, Georgia's, again, and I do think they have some nice pieces. I'll be very interested to see how Blaylock recovers because his game is not necessarily predicated on athleticism as it is, and if he loses even half a step, that is, I think, going to affect his future. But, you know, Marcus Roseme's going to have an opportunity to step in and play well next year, and Georgia's kind of going to need him to do that. You know, you'd probably think Georgia would look to go out and maybe find another Lawrence Cager out there, a grad transfer who could come in and help because, you know, Tyler Simmons is going to be gone and Cager won't be back. So, I mean, George Pickens is your lead guy, obviously, and then Blaylock with his health, who knows? There are still just as many questions about this wide receiver room at the start of the 2020 season as there are at the end of the 2019 season.
Sean Dunn says that Fromm's only going to be a backup quarterback in the NFL. Here's what I believe. I think it's still way too early to determine exactly what Jake Fromm's ultimate legacy as a quarterback is. My assumption is he'll be back in Georgia next year. That's not a given, but that's my assumption right now. And if he does, that's another opportunity to kind of continue to write his chapter. After all, you know, over the course of 3 years, even though the 2019 season doesn't end the way that you want it to, Jake Fromm's made some big throws for Georgia and provided some big-time wins. I think that Jake Fromm has established more credentials than some people want to give him credit for. And even if 2019 was, at the very least, not a step forward and quite possibly a step back, there is still plenty more to be added to the future of Jake Fromm. So if you gave me my choice of any reasonable option to be quarterback at Georgia in 2020, reasonable option of guys they may be able to bring in as either a transfer or as a incoming freshman or whatever else, my choice for quarterback for Georgia next season is still Jake Fromm. And while I will, on one hand, say that Fromm deserves more criticism for this season than he's gotten publicly, I'm not going to take it as far as some of y'all want to go, because some of you want to cast him aside, and I'm not doing that. I think he's too good to be cast aside. And I think the actual overall story of how he compares to some of these other quarterbacks, Justin Fields included, is more complicated than some people want to give it credit for. So I am willing to acknowledge that too much blame has been put one place for the failing of the Georgia offense this year, but that doesn't mean I'm done with Jake Fromm. I'm not done with Jake Fromm by a long shot. As a fan of Georgia, I hope that Jake's back next season, and then I hope that he's able to finish his career on a high note.
Yeah, for the people that want to push Jake Fromm out, who is going to step in next year and not before even considering the idea of maybe being better than him, just replace him? I mean, give me a name. I don't think Derek King is coming here unless they make some radical changes to this offense. So if you can give me a name and a guy who's certainly you can prove is better than Jake Fromm, go ahead. But Georgia's right now, their best starting quarterback option in 2020 is Jake Fromm coming back for his senior season.
Yeah, I absolutely believe that's true. All right, we're going to get ready to go here because this is, I said before, we're going to give people their piece to sort of say, what they want to say. This was obviously over the course of a full season, and for all intents and purposes, the Georgia season done. This was a broken offense this year, and we were willing to let it play out and hope that it showed up big in a big moment and kind of recast the way the rest of the season looked. That never happened. I promised that if you'd just be patient and let the season play out, I'd give you your say when it was over to say, see, I told you so. And that reckoning is going to be coming over the course of the next couple of days. But, at the same time, I'm also not going to, go as far as some of y'all seem to want to go in terms of all of a sudden now things are broken and can never be fixed. Some people in message boards on Twitter and wherever else just seem to live for the moment of wallowing in that negativity. And if you get, kind of turned off by that, then you don't have to watch the comments. You can just watch me. You can just listen to me, and we'll try to narrate this experience in a little bit more sort of level-headed, honest, and open way than that. All right. Good stuff. We appreciate you being here and being a part of all that. And we're going to keep following all this and sort of deciding where it goes. We appreciate you being a part of our R.S. Andrews Cool Down today. Georgia's obviously got a lot of big questions to answer in the days ahead. The good news is that means the news should be kind of coming fast and furious in terms of all this. Rumors of Luke or anybody else becoming, a part of the Georgia staff, finding out if there is any kind of alteration made to the Georgia offense. We'll be watching it closely and following it carefully and discussing it boldly with you every time we get together. So before we go, let me also say thanks to our friends at the AJC for keeping us up to date with our Atlanta news now. Big time information on the SunTrust merger for those of you that follow the Atlanta business scene. How the commute around Atlanta could change depending on how, some transit laws going to come into place. Also Falcons got a win yesterday against Carolina, so kind of an interesting scenario there, kind of a surprising situation. So we'll kind of touch on that. There's also a water main break near Grady Hospital following that. You can actually check in throughout the day and get your Atlanta news now at ajc.com. Also, thanks to our friends Dari and the whole team over there at R.S. Andrews, bringing the R.S. Andrews Cool Down to you, possible for you. Whether it be air, heating, plumbing, electric, whatever your need might be, story after story, R.S. Andrews has been delivering smiles, and they can deliver smiles for you. But you've got to find them online at rsandrews.com. You'll have a great day. I'll look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow at 10 a.m. for another episode of DawgNation Daily, presented by Georgia United Credit Union. Have a good afternoon. We'll talk to you then.